Would you support a mandatory environmental service for adults 18-30? Kind of like military service, but instead of fighting you must spend a few months on reforestation projects or ocean cleanup? Why or why not? Not mandatory, but there was a voluntary program like this in the US in the Depression. It was called the Civilian Conservation Corps. Participants got room and board, clothing, job training, and $30 a month, of which $25 had to be sent home. Most were single young men, so it went to their parents and younger siblings, in exchange for working on various projects on The reasons for it were both to provide jobs and because the Dust Bowl had opened people's eyes to the fact that the US was not a bottomless well of natural resources. Erosion was a big cause of the Dust Bowl, and the Dust Bowl was a factor in the Depression, so it all tied together. They were also called Roosevelt's Tree Army, because one of the big things they did was plant trees for erosion control. In my state, they built most of the state parks, a lot of them in areas that had been deforested for charcoal manufacturing and were marginal for agriculture. You can still rent out cabins that they built, and they're great, really attractive, and shockingly inexpensive. I'm actually going to stay in one next week. Some of them have photos from the CCC days on the walls, and it's really neat to look at them and know that you're still enjoying what they worked on. I'd definitely support a program like that today, but I think making it voluntary is putting ethical considerations to one side, more practical. For one thing, you would have to pay participants, just like people drafted for military service get paid, and it would be very expensive if everyone did it. Plus, having it be voluntary means the number of participants can be matched the amount of meaningful work to be done, and the workers are more motivated. With the CCC, people considered themselves lucky to be picked. $30 a month was an attractive wage, and 3 square meals every single day was a significant perk, so discipline was straightforward. Do what you're supposed to do or get kicked out. And most people didn't want to get kicked out. It would probably take stronger incentives to get the same level of buy-in today, but healthcare and student loan forgiveness would be a good start. There are still programs like this around. AmeriCorps is the offspring of the CCC. Within AmeriCorps is the Conservation Corps. Members of the Conservation Corps do tons of habitat restoration, trail building, prescribed burns, etc. I was even on a crew that did wildlife research, but that isn't as common. While the benefits aren't as big, some crews offer housing. You automatically get approved for food stamps, get a monthly stipend, and at the end of your term you get an education award that can be used towards college or student loans you already have. I think they offer insurance as well, but I never needed it. When you go on overnight work trips called spikes, you get a daily food allowance, and they pay for you to stay somewhere, which is usually a campground. Our ocean, rivers and beaches are filled with plastic trash. Pollution from plastic has created a health crisis for our entire planet. That's why I am on Team C's. What about you? After saving the air by planting 20 million trees, Mr. Beast and Mark Rober are now saving the oceans by removing 30 million pounds of plastic trash. To make this crazy YouTube dream reality, go to teamseas.org. We need to raise $30 million to remove 30 million pounds of plastic from our oceans, rivers and beaches. 100% of the money we raise goes directly to our partners, Ocean Conservancy and the Ocean Cleanup. So head on over to teamseas.org. I feel like instead of forcing people to do so, they should be encouraged to. For example, if this was being forced by the state, instead of it forcing you to go, it would pay people to plant trees, clean beaches, etc. This is the way to go. This is how you create jobs. The world's biggest economic demand should absolutely be its own well-being. If we don't have a planet, your money is worthless. We already have AmeriCorps, where you serve for very little compensation other than a stipend and some money for college. Someone suggested that awareness should be raised about this sort of program, and I think they were right. Thank you for contributing to the discussion. I feel like forcing people to do it will just sour them against it. Also, I see people who make a career out of it frick crap up all the time, and I can only imagine how unproductive a bunch of people who don't want to be there in the first place would be. Also, the big thing we are lacking isn't manpower for most of these projects, But funding. There is a backlog of people who are passionate about nature and have education and professional qualifications that can't find work because no one wants to leave their jobs. If the government were willing to dump a bunch of money into funding more projects, then there would be more room in the budget to hire people who want to be there. No need to conscript people. And if people don't want to do it, the police will come in and enforce it by putting them in jail. And those who control the admissions will be taking kickbacks to let the rich or their friends' kids not having to do it. Number. Some of us need to earn a living. Who's going to pay our rent etc while we're doing this? Will we lose our houses, apartments if we're not earning money for months on end and can't pay rent? Also, however worthy the cause, forced labor is still slavery, and therefore completely immoral. Better to convince people to care enough to volunteer to help out in their free time, or pass legislation forcing companies to stop using plastic, etc. By forcing people to do this against their will, you will turn them off the cause and make them less likely to care for the planet, recycle, etc. in the long run. There's no way it would be unpaid. Many countries have forced military conscription for a specific number of years, South Korea, Singapore, etc., and are all paid by the government. I wouldn't be averse to something like this, but assuming that it would be unpaid is ridiculous. No, for pretty much every reason already given here. I would like to thank OP though for being so civil and polite when responding to people. It's a much better way to discuss things than just screaming at each other. Thank you for answer. I hope I've been able to foster a productive and polite conversation. I certainly feel like I've learned a lot. I think our best way forward is to discuss as many solutions to the climate crisis as possible. Some will be unacceptable and others less so, but we can't find them without talking about them. Military is not mandatory. It's also not a few months. Would you get paid and have benefits? If not, most people cannot afford a few months of not getting paid. So the old people who ruined the environment can force the young people to clean it up? Idiotic idea. Hate to break it to you, but the old people aren't cleaning it up. It's the younger generations or no one. Mandatory? No, especially not based on a military design where the government can dictate where you move and serve. Incentivized? For sure. A coordinated environmental task force jobs program along these lines, built for young and or underemployed people, would be awesome. I'm not confident this would fix our global environmental issues without being accompanied by a serious effort on behalf of the corporate world to reduce pollution waste. But it won't hurt, and it's a good way to get people involved in conservation at an early age. Nothing that drastic. I'd say more like heavily encouraged to do environmental work. I don't think it should be mandatory. No, and after discussion in the comments I've come to the conclusion that incentives like a free college tuition would be much more useful than making it mandatory. That seems to be the general consensus. No, because I don't think transporting millions of young people out of cities, towns and rural areas to these destinations and forcing them to work will be helpful. I get that they need to be made conscious of environmental issues, but I just don't think it would be effective, as in actually helping to get the work done. They could only do work that they wouldn't need a qualification or any special skills for. It would be a massive safety issue, making sure they don't drown cleaning the ocean or get injured planting trees. And it would cost massive amounts of money to pay, house and feed them all. I generally don't think it's effective or fair to govern over people's lifetime like this. Whether it's military service or this type of thing, it would be much more effective to have qualified workers do the work effectively and have all other people study and or learn other skills as quickly as possible so that you can cut back on benefits. Give them the ability to earn money and care for themselves, and as a result also have them pay taxes sooner and longer, which will make it easier to fund the environmental projects. Mandatory? Number. You shouldn't force people into things they don't want to do, but I think maybe offer something that would entice people, like paying off 50% of their student debt. No, because that assumes that the state has a natural right to my free labor and time. That crap is for communist countries, not us. Maybe it's because here military service is not mandatory, so I didn't grow up with that mentality, but I don't think that kind of service should be mandatory. There are some projects where prisoners kind of do that, but while it would help, I think in the long run it would be better for people to do it voluntarily. The mandatory part is the problem. I would, however, support the use of on-duty military in those projects since that's the actual existential threat. This would be much more fitting as an alternative to regular incarceration. In the US we need a complete rework of prison systems anyway. Making prisoners accountable and functioning parts of society while serving time has great rehabilitation potential. Also, giving them minimum wage for commissary, savings, and their family on the outside would be great too. It seems like a good idea but it really isn't. We should care more about the environment but mandatory service would be very inconvenient. At this age we are dealing with stress after stress after stress. I would not want to have to put everything on hold for mandatory environmental service. While it's for a good cause, people might start to resent it and not want anything to do with the environment after. IDK. Just my opinion. There should be another way to get people to care more about the environment, but this shouldn't be it. Isn't this already a thing with public schools? I know Chicago high school students are required to do at least 40 hours of volunteering. Number. If most of the environmental damage is caused by corporations seeking profits, corporations should pay to clean up. Another example of privatizing the profits and socializing the losses. I have no freaking clue how I had to scroll down so far to find this. People seem to fundamentally misunderstand what climate change is and why it is happening. Hint, it isn't litter. Not mandatory. I have a baby on the way and would not be chill at all with the government forcing me to be separated from him. Also, I don't think it would foster a very productive work environment for those involved. Most people would be mad to be forced and so would have poor work ethic, and it would actually make people care about and want to help the environment less. Then there's the question of if it would be paid. If it's not, you have people losing homes, credit getting ruined, and whole livelihoods being destroyed. If it is paid, you still have the problem of how some of those people would pay their bills. For most that would be fairly simple, assuming they're always able to access the internet, which is unlikely, but some people have bills that are still accepting payment in the Stone Age, as in they expect them to mail or hand deliver the payment. For example, discount motors near where I live, and frankly, I'm completely against the government making any action mandatory. Yes, I would support it. Now the real question is, who's going to pay my mortgage, childcare, utilities, food, etc. while I frick off to the forest for 2 months? I wouldn't, simply because environmental issues can't be fixed by individuals, but rather by corporations. The work that individuals do would do nothing to combat the thousands of acres of private land where trees are cut daily or the insane amount of emissions that factories give out. And it would also create a sense of entitlement among the richest who control the corporations. We spent X amount of time fixing the Earth's environment, so we now have a free chit to do whatever we want with it. A man chooses, a slave obeys. I will never give up my freedom to the state. Consent is key in all situations. Also, taxation is theft. Mandatory is something that I do not abide with. Instead, I would suggest incentive. Much like requiring a license and insurance to operate a vehicle on public roads. You don't have to acquire these, but if you want to drive, then it is your prerogative. What I would suggest is programs that, for example, substitute waived tuition fees for your time and efforts. If it is your prerogative to receive an education, then this is something to consider. The army does exactly this with their programs. You give your time and effort, they educate you, you apply these skills and knowledge to the army for a while and then to yourself. It's mutually beneficial. Everybody wins. There is gonna be a mandatory in the same fashion in France soon for 16-year-olds. It's called civil service and it consists in working for society, which of course includes environmental matters. Not unless it provides equivalent rewards, which it probably won't. I've used this point multiple times, but how should people care to support the environment if they can't or can barely even support themselves? Forcing anyone to do anything is both morally wrong and ipso facto an inefficient allocation of resources. No matter how much you believe a cause is just and righteous, compelling others to serve that cause makes you an evil person. You don't have to make it mandatory, just tie it to free college or some other social benefit. And why limit it to the environment? Why not help with disaster recovery or other social problems? This way you help your fellow man and you're rewarded for your effort. Absolutely not. Offer the program with some nice incentives, such as college grants, health benefits, or something people would want to their benefit, but you cannot make it mandatory. I think forcing them would only make them grow disdain for it. Similar to being forced to go to church every Sunday. I didn't grow to appreciate it. I freaking hated it, and it's a large reason why I began studying into it more and eventually became atheist. What would be infinitely healthier? Promoting and encouraging it, especially in young kids. I mean, is there any education about this outside of maybe a science teacher bringing it up once? People shouldn't be forced to do things, I don't think. Teach people to care. Teach, not tell them to. Mandatory anything is usually terrible public policy. There are a lot of people with physical and mental disabilities which would make this sort of commitment very hard on them. Real charity cannot be forced. Force people to do something and at best it will be half-assed, but more often than not this will result in corruption and other issues. People really don't like the draft, so no. Sure, there are people that would be willing, but the uproar of being forced to do something might have people try to reverse our gains we've made out of spite. I'm opposed if it's mandatory. There are people that have a plan for their lives and there are people that don't. Help those that don't have a plan. Don't make it mandatory. Use the EPA or create a new department in charge of the program. Then use the program to help the environment while fighting unemployment. Pay a livable wage. Hire and train the unemployed, veterans, special needs people, the homeless, ex-convicts, etc. Use it as a lucrative alternative to free public assistance. There are plenty of people that would apply if a real accessible opportunity was made available. No, if it is mandatory people are gonna hate it and we will end up worse than we started. I think it should be done voluntarily, and mandatory only for inmates. No, it is never a good idea to force people to do things they don't want to do. I was forced to go to Sunday school as a child and absolutely resented it to the point I lost all interest in anything to do with religion. If you want people to take an interest in something, forcing them to do so is the worst possible step you can take. No, because I don't think that anyone should be forced into completing something they don't wish to do. Not unless this mandatory service would provide free food, board, and a generous salary to all workers to compensate for infringing on our freedom of choice. While this would be a huge strain on the budget, not working or going to school for months would be a huge burden on young adults. No, because most of us are just living our lives and doing jobs. We shouldn't have to clean up for what other people have done. Number. The government has no right to force me what to do. The government should focus primarily on educating people about the environment and why we should protect it. Forcing people to do crap most of the time doesn't lead too far. Well, in my country we have mandatory military service, which is complete bulls. I mean, you get trained for like 1 month and then you have 8 months of dicking around, cleaning and doing maintenance work in some military bases. I would rather work and do actual community service or do some volunteerish work like work in an animal shelter, do reforestation services, etc. That would be another pointless feel-good exercise that shifts responsibility further from the people that are actually fricking the planet. The only environmentalism that has any significant effect is increased industry regulation. Number. Any form of draft results in a huge waste of time, especially for students, and they pay next to nothing. You can pay people to do it instead. Absolutely, at least for anyone receiving unemployment benefits. I was at a loose end when I was 19 and did a program set up in Australia that was geared towards skilling up people my age by doing a 6-month, hands-on conservation program. It was great. Taught me things I'd never have learned otherwise, like how to use a chainsaw, weed management, what native tree to plant where, etc. Lots of young guys did the program. I could see it benefiting them, especially the guys that had left school early and hadn't really had the option, or hadn't chosen, to go into a trade or to uni. Good stuff. But mandatory? Perhaps not. Maybe not mandatory, but more opportunities for young people, like myself, to help the environment. The youth strikes have convinced many to do things to help the environment, use less plastic, go vegan, buy second-hand etc. But there's not many initiatives for teens and young adults to meet and do environmental services. Even things like community gardens and beach cleanup teams could bring people together and help stop climate change. We all need to be supporting Greta Thunberg and all of the people fighting for our planet in making a difference. Never. America has fought and bled for freedom. Freedom is the reason for America. It's the ideal that brings us together. When you take that freedom away, even if it's to defend freedom such as in a draft, you're spitting in the face of liberty. America was built on slavery, aka the opposite of freedom, you freaking buffoon. Nope, you are not entitled to the labor of others, and you're asking young people to clean up a mess they didn't make too. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.